Yes. Welcome, Dennis. What happened there?
Oh my, I don't know. WebEx has me in zombie land, so I couldn't hear a thing, couldn't unmute, so I connected through my cell phone as an alternative. So sorry for the audio quality.
Oh yeah, that's why. Maybe that's why I was, Russ. I never use the computer audio unless I have to.
Well,
I'm on the phone
it didn't
too.
work
Maybe
for
that's
me
why
at all.
Okay, cool. Interesting.
Maybe
As I said, I was
send
telling some of you guys
chat
before,
to people.
IBM changed some of the WebEx behaviors now, so there's something else I got to look into a little bit more what they've done. But I was hoping it wasn't the IBM side that blocked you out. Okay, Dennis, I sent your latest thing out a little late today, so unfortunately I did that. But I thank you again for continuing to keep an eye on that. Do you want to take us through the deck? I mean, you can share your screen and take us through. And I know there's some discussions. I know Jason piped in. I think
Awesome.
I think David piped in a little bit on some of the emails that were flying around before the meeting. So that's good news. We got discussions before the meeting. I love it.
That's all my job is to provoke discussion. Can you see anything now?
Yes.
Is it okay in terms of readability?
Yeah, you can put it in slideshow mode if you want, or does that bother you?
Let me see if I can do that.
Down the bottom there, that little screen down the bottom right side will get you slideshow. That's good.
This works?
Yeah, that works.
Okay. The point of this deck first is to respond to Russ's request for diagrams as opposed to the text in the last discussion, and secondly, to try to put a bow around my concern over sort of the semantic gap I think exists between extending into EDR/XDR use cases and what happens with just indicators and relatively simple actions, that the gap between those is large. And I'd like to just express why I think that's the case. If we can get to a consensus around that, I have some recommendations on how to move forward. Even with the relatively simple side of the fence, talking to modern EDR and XDR systems seems to have an awful lot of what's in those systems in terms of semantics, detection, the understanding of how indicators are connected to the alerts. That stuff is very much buried behind two places. What happens in the instrumentation points themselves where detection occurs, and separately what happens in their analytics framework, increasingly loaded into the cloud for a strategic advantage among many of the solutions. And the second is I think that we're going to need, and I think we can leverage existing models, but we're going to need models to be a first-class player in how to leverage things across EDRs. The first example of the challenge is essentially this. Every EDR instrumentation that does detection on an endpoint does so with some fairly sophisticated capabilities, from either heuristic detection mechanisms to potentially trained inference mechanisms that get shoved down to the endpoint for real-time and inline kinds of inhibition that they can provide to emergent attack behavior. In that, those are a complex mapping from something that is relatively normalized, the interface to the underlying platform, where in Windows it might be the registry and its Hive, the files and the shadow file system, the things that you talk to in the underpinnings, essentially. Those are fairly normalized. But what happens in terms of the heuristics, the trained inference models and other stuff, highly variant across different EDR and XDR solutions, and only get coherent again at the back-end analytics across, again, the EDR solutions. There is a subset of capabilities that are the simple talk to a file, talk to a registry, talk to a process kind of stuff, but that is a very small subset of modern sort of attack indication and the small subset of the context you need in order to effectively respond. there's a separate locus that is relatively opaque information across EDR solutions. It is different EDR solutions, but absolutely consistent across the deployment of any one EDR solution. And that's that back-end analytics mechanism where increasingly correlation, behavioral stuff, training happen, but are very idiosyncratic to the particular EDR or XDR technology involved. There is another normalization that happens ahead of that, though. All of them ingest, for instance, IOCs, and increasingly are paying more attention to things like the MITRE ATT&CK and defend models as the sort of EDR agnostic, or at least tool agnostic representation of attack behavior that gets a lot more tool specific when you use other standards, like Mike as part of the long-term sticks portfolio. In that makes it a very, very different. Go ahead.
This is Forrest.
Hey, Forrest.
And so when you were getting your audio stuff squared away, you missed one of the points that I made. First point was that I like your slide deck. The second point that I make is I don't fully understand. I'm not expert enough in some of this stuff here to fully understand your slide deck. So because I think it's such an important slide deck, I would like to fully understand it. So I'm going to pull over to, I'm going to look at it on my screen because I can make it a little bit larger. So if you don't mind, I would actually like to fully understand what I'm looking at on slide 4. So
oh yeah.
You have EDR agent I on the right side. You have EDR agent sub I and sub I. Those are both agents of the same tool suite, correct? Is the same agent, or does that intend to be 2 different agents?
They're probably 2 different agents, 2 different endpoints, but exactly the same EDR solution, such that there is coherence in those gears that you see behind the scenes, the heuristics and trained models, and in the back-end analytics where training will occur, where the heuristics will be defined, where the idiosyncratic mapping of the particular EDR technology is all reconciled and glued together. This is the whole diagram here is one EDR solution deployed across a couple of agents in this example.
Oh, okay, I see. So you maintain the management in the cloud and you employ it, so you employ that solution to, so you have 2 different, so you have 2 different endpoints you're showing on the right side. Is that correct?
Exactly. That is.
Okay. Okay, so maybe I would label them a little differently so I understand they're 2 different endpoints. Just a comment. Because,
the only
because
the only clue there is that there's 2 registries. Absolutely. I should have made it clear.
Okay. And then on the left, you have mining orgs, risk model. Okay, those are the inputs to developing your EDR model. Is that there are solution-specific capabilities, like the mining that happens for Carbon Black happens in the Carbon Black cloud, and it uses Carbon Black machine learning algorithm training to create inference engines that it can then shove down to the endpoints. The only way to make sense of the alerts that you have is to understand what the training base is in order to know why that thing triggered on what it triggered, right? So there's coherence across all the endpoints for any one deployment of that particular technology using machine learning, but it's completely incoherent across 2 different machine learning technologies. Does that make sense? Right. You never be able to compare the 2 directly, right?
Exactly.
Okay, and so what is when you say IOCs and auto, what does the word auto underneath that mean? I didn't understand that.
So it's automation that might use the very normal kind of automation, like I'm using the platform's capabilities to set access control or to change access control. Those are things that are part of the underlying platform, not necessarily a proper part of the EDR, but certainly in their vocabulary of actions they might take. IOCs exist completely independently, expressed in Cybox, for instance, under sticks. Might be completely independent of the EDR system, and that's one of those other normalization boundaries where we could make sense of things. Go ahead.
Right. No, I'm tracking. Okay, and I apologize, everybody, if I'm dragging you through stuff that you guys have all worked out here. I'll try to minimize it. Okay, go ahead. Thank you.
So this slide, okay, the only thing I didn't talk about is the dashed line between the two endpoints. That's where sort of the XDR point of view comes in, things like last line, which pay attention exclusively to network traffic and know nothing about the endpoint proper, but give you a lot of information about inter-endpoint behavior. And that intersection becomes part and parcel of XDR. You see it inside of, what was it? I think stick shifter has been extended to include the is it Tenable stuff? One of them has some XDR capability. I'll show that in a subsequent slide. So the next slide just says, okay, try to make sense of all this stuff across different EDR telemetries in the same environment, and you wind up with this huge problem that there isn't that coherence across sort of the signals that you're getting back. In fact, it's highly fragmented. So when you try to do sense making, when you try to say, okay, what might have caused this and what therefore is the proper mitigation or remediation for that matter, or response, you don't have the coherence and the ability to dive into some level of explainability, but worse, the action vocabularies and the action loci, the places in which the actions are going to be taken by the EDR tools may be completely incompatible. I might decide to, for instance, in last line, block things at a firewall where the right alternative response in an endpoint EDR might be completely different. If you don't have those synchronized, I can have two sets of things that, while protected in isolation, in combination, have an impedance mismatch that creates an attack or a defeat in detailed opportunity. There isn't the consistency in response. There certainly isn't the consistency in the interpretive context behind the scenes. And it's because of this complexity. This problem doesn't necessarily exist for relatively simple circumstances. But when you're dealing with modern ransomware or supply chain attacks that are inside out, where the vulnerability and the compromise all both pre-exist, the complexity is substantially higher. In a couple of conversations, there was an appeal to stick shifter as a demonstration that there was a basis for sort of a level of uniformity across them. What I try to compare here is precisely the stick shifter adapters for three, it was Trend, for three of the EDR systems, and Trend is probably more XDR-ish given that it has some network behavior being expressed there. And there isn't a lot of commonality. If I try to execute the same commands or try to interpret the same signals across these three EDRs, there are going to be significant places where I'm going to be wrong in the conclusions I'm drawing because of the variability in the underpinnings, in the mappings themselves. I think those exist primarily because there isn't a model to reconcile them, but that is getting better over time as all of the EDR vendors and the XDR capabilities begin to converge. As that happens, we're beginning to see a move toward coherence about what they're describing, because they recognize the need to play into a broader ecosystem as well. But right now, it's pretty balkanized. When we look at the malware itself, this is invariant. That is, all the EDRs are getting a vantage perspective on this behavior or this kind of behavior. The things to pay attention to are that, of course, there are multiple different behaviors. Increasingly, malware payloads include multiple different exploit behaviors and escalation behaviors and reconnaissance and lateral movement behaviors within them. But there is also in this diagram right at the middle a switch between endpoints. This behavior is expressed across multiple endpoints because I've got reconnaissance and lateral movement right in the middle. And so you get this temporal relationship between indications, and the indications are the breadcrumbs that any one of these TTPs will leave. And so if I get an indicator in a sticks communication, it's going to be subtle evidence that one of these things might have happened. But there's a relationship here, and that relation is temporal and causal. That is, I know that some of these things must have happened before others. I know that there are multiple different alternatives to permutations, and you know that there are multiple endpoints involved. This is sort of where you begin to get at what a model brings to the table in terms of making sense of the relationship between indications and the consequent mitigations that you might take, and then remediation in the long term. But the biggest gap is one behind the heuristics. Go ahead. Any questions?
No, I just wanted to stop you there to highlight the significance of what Dennis just said and ask on your behalf, does everybody get that? The idea of these relationships being temporal and current databases and standards and stuff that we have generally do not do a good job of incorporating the idea of time, which is a kind of a prerequisite or a partner challenge to incorporate the idea of causality. Temporal correlation doesn't necessarily or lead to causation, but it's often a good indicator and a kind of a necessity. It's insufficient, but it's a good necessity and a lot of causality determination. So the models that so the knowledge modeling piece that we do, taking it to that level, allows us to help get to that challenge in ways that we have not previously been able to do.
There's another thing that happens here as well. When you get this sort of temporal relationship, if you take these in concert with that temporal relationship, the signal to noise ratio drops right through the floor because you've got this sequence of things that is your filter for looking at what otherwise might be an unorganized set of stuff. So it becomes really interesting in addressing the signal to noise problem.
The new filter. Okay, so that's why IOCs are insufficient, because IOCs are by their nature mainly static. And when we had this discussion with people talking about behavior modeling, I don't know where that group has gone. I haven't heard from who's actually in that group and where they've gone and what they're working on lately, but that's why I suggest that the behavior modeling is that we have that tied to our ontology work, because that's how we can have the computer understand the behavior in the way that we understand it.
Makes so much sense.
Yeah, so, to me and you it makes sense, but I would just like to, like a poll to the rest of the people. Is it just a party of, are Dennis and I just having our own little hug fest, or is this make perfect sense to everybody else on the call? And if it doesn't, how can we help? How can we help solidify that so it's a bigger hug fest?
So I got a question. The red sequence of events that you're showing here, is that something that you have done by hand? You've created this signature of attacks yourself, or was a machine learning system able to do a hidden Markov model to see these sequence of events and observe that they happened in that sequence?
No, this is the representation. Yeah, this is just the standard MITRE representation of the actual behavior of an actual attack. So this is a particular one. I didn't grab the name of it, but I can send you the link. So this is the canonical first splash page graphic off of their why do you want to use MITRE ATT&CK as a mechanism for talking about attacks, decoupled from the particular tools that give you the telemetry on the attacks. And so it really is just a demonstration of behavior. Go ahead.
So this is from the attack framework, and they have a whole collection of these sequence diagrams. I think I'm joining the Hugfest now.
And then there is also the. Go ahead.
Let me just put one caveat with that. They do it, so they have this kind of sequencing, but in some cases, these representations aren't necessarily logically put together in some cases. So what do I mean by that? In some cases, they will have an action. So there'll be an action, and then they have an effect, and then an effect which goes to an action or a person. So they end up mixing apples and oranges and pears in their sequencing. So some of them shouldn't really be a temporal relationship or not. But we can fix that stuff to make it more logically consistent. But I mean, this is really good. This is the best that we have right now, frankly. So, so it's just not just so my point being, it's not quite machine computable yet. That's all.
So completely agree. There is that tenuous evolution of these various representations and their utility that I think we're beginning to understand more completely. But the purpose in this presentation is just to show what kind of value this presents to the person confronted with signal, trying to make a decision about what to do, and in that, how things are changing and why in the market and the consumption of technology to deal with advanced threat response, especially emergent stuff. I meant it also in the bottom line to extend to the analytics. That is, as soon as you recognize that there's a temporal relationship between the indications that you can see and or the behaviors that you detect, instantly things change. You can't then talk about malware as just a set of behaviors you observe. You've got a sequence of behaviors. And so the kinds of machine learning, for instance, that can deal with time series are very limited. They're not support vector machines. They're hidden Markov models and Kalman models. And when those are different across the underlying detection mechanisms, your ability to do anything but make sense at the indicator level or at the asset instrumentation level is really challenged, because you've got an awful lot of context and training and internal opaque model that interferes with you just dealing with the vendor's telemetry at anything but the two boundary conditions, if that makes sense. And what it leads to is different tools seeing exactly the same thing with a very, very, very different signal. Here we have Carbon Black and FireEye going against the MITRE simulation of one specific attack, the Carbonac stuff in particular in this case, and you can see the signal differences between them. There is not a ton of commonality, except that one of them is going to recognize Carbonac and the other one will recognize Carbonac. So it's at the boundaries that you wind up having an ability to normalize and make sense across tools. It's probably not in the instrumentation, the recognition, and the analytics underpinnings, if that makes sense. All that says is that you really want to talk to the EDR, the XDR system, and probably not directly to the telemetry on the endpoint, except in the most straightforward of circumstances. This gets emphasized one more time when you see the relationship between the data sources that provide detection, the techniques that stimulate what we have with respect to the behaviors themselves, and then the mitigation. For every kind of technique, there are multiple data sources that get used in different ways to detect them, and multiple mitigations that make sense from different perspectives for exactly the same techniques. They balkanize explicitly right across all of when you change EDR or XDR systems, that's what causes the permutation across these various looks at things. And of course, why MITRE is actually doing the evaluation of actual tools against repeated known attack behaviors in order to characterize those differences. So it's just a hard thing to do to normalize right in the middle of this. But at the edges, you've got places where you can make sense of things because you get back into comprehensible terms that are more comparable, unless we've got a model to help make sense. Now, what's the impact of this on the OODA loop? Well, it's significant in that it's at orientation that all that context comes to bear. And it's the context that's getting fragmented when you have in one enterprise multiple different EDR tools that have these opaque, different, and complex models that interferes with the ability to orient. It does fragment and possibly makes inconsistent the consequent action like mitigation or remediation when one is viewing the world as a bunch of NIC termination points and the other is viewing the world as a bunch of endpoints, all of which have system SIDs or IP addresses and an operating system instance behind them. And so that balkanization has interfered with, and I think continues to interfere with, our ability to do things at scale in environments where there's lots of variation in the complex security portfolios. My suggestion is just this. I think we need to do a couple of things at the same time. There are some very, very useful things we can do quickly in the meantime without having to address these thorny problems. They aren't in the extended EDR and XDR use case domain, but they're very useful, and that probably should happen fast. And I think being able to use posture collection to enhance that and the emergent de facto posture standards makes all kinds of sense. I just don't think it can extend to the ambition to address the more advanced EDR and XDR use cases, especially in the advanced ransomware and supply chain attack domains, places that have real need for normalization of that information pretty quickly. I think that's going to take models, and I think a lot of those models, at least the underpinnings of them exist, although they need to be refined for the application that we're looking at, as I think Duncan was suggesting. I'm sorry if I misrecognized your name, Duncan. I thought it was you that was making the comment. So I think the two directions are complementary, but they do get in each other's way in the sense that in conversations and in the efforts that we're doing, there are things that can be done in the near term, and we should proceed on those. But there is a need, I think, for a parallel conversation on looking at the models and how to leverage them, how to refine them, how to do what we need to do there, if that makes sense. And that's really just the conclusion I came to. But I wanted to make it clear why, and I wanted to respond to a need to make my internal rafflings more digestible with the diagrams. With that, I'll open up to you guys and push back to your heart's content.
So this is Russ. I'll just make a couple of comments. Some of it, and thank you very much for this excellent, thorough investigation. I really appreciate the layout and how clean it was. And thank you very much for my pictures. I really love those. Appreciate that. So, but part one of me thinks, Dennis, who's surprised that it's balkanized and everything's all over the place and it's complex, right? That's kind of, to me, that's the nature
the state of the industry.
Right, that's why we're here, right? I get you. I also agree with your comment, and I've experienced this before back in the days of networks and systems where you have a very low set of commonality, you'll call them rudimentary or very basic things, and you evolve them over time. You extend your model, right? Which is what they're trying to do with sticks and taxing the threat intelligence models. Over time, you just keep evolving it and getting more common. You guarantee will never get 100% common of everything. You hope to get a good portion, hopefully enough to make it worthwhile, right? To make it standardization so it's effective, rather than it's too balkanized and standardization makes it worse, which is possible. So, I think, your comment there on, it will evolve over time. I agree with, and that's kind of why this iterative approach to, the stick standards and so forth. The instrumentation has to keep chewing away at what you would call a balkanization or the inconsistencies of the approaches that everything's taken. So just those comments is, I'm not surprised to see this, and that's exactly what we're seeing, and hence the complexity of today's environment is there's very much not a set of common things. Therefore, they're not going to act in a common way, right? And therefore, you got the things, the mentions you had about how things are so different and how they're done, right? Some of it I'll conjecture, and this is a good debate, is I don't really care how some of this stuff is done, as long as I can, from the other side of it, ask it a question consistently and get its answer. However it came up with it, two brains could come up with the same answer different ways. I'm okay with that, but as long as there's some way I could get a consistent action response from them, I'm okay with that as well. But I love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think as long as you can completely decouple the decision to take action and the infrastructure in which you do it from the place where you ask the question, where does this indicator exist, for instance, files or processes or things like that, then I think you've got a shot at better consistency. If, however, you're relying on the endpoint to give you the indicator and very different endpoints to do an action, but to do it in a consistent way, I think that's where we run into real problems, because each of the tools actually views what they're seeing from a very different perspective. XDR and EDR are the most extreme in that one looks at the world as a bunch of network endpoints, the other looks at the world as a bunch of computational endpoints, and the actions they take, whatever they are not easily reconciled, and if they're mixed in an environment, they actually create a problem. In that they don't get you a consistent defense as a system, if you will. You get instead a fairly balkanized sort of assertion of your action into the environment. If they are all the same technology, however, it's a different story. while you may not understand what's going on, there's a whole
Right.
lot of consistency to it.
Yeah, behind the curtain, right? Exactly. But
Yeah.
your argument, what you just said there, Dennis, is XDR is going to be a tough road to hoe for people that are trying to go from EDR to XDR.
Well, I think there's a natural convergence to those two things, and that every one of the vendor solutions will do something about it. But the vendors are realizing that the complexity of the security portfolio is a barrier to value. It's a
Yes.
barrier to effectiveness.
Yes.
And so I think this is where MITRE has done some service, in that
Yes.
there's so much utility to being able to get an attack simulator, to be able to talk across tools about attack behavior, which is what the attack model does, but also about defense behavior. There are multiple normalizations there, that each of the vendors is beginning to reconsider how they represent what they're seeing so that they can actually fully leverage that normalized model. And that's bringing them to a common ground that, while not complete, is certainly better than it was before the introduction of that level of normalization.
Absolutely.
The interest in having them fit into an ecosystem, even more compelling. Customers are not going to be buying 70 different tools and cobbling together their security portfolios with duct tape and baling wire going into the future. That hasn't worked. It's not gonna. And so I think there are the right economic motives and motivations in place, and the opportunity to do something about it without having to invent the wheel or push big rocks uphill. They won't be complete, so there's lots of opportunity to make that better, but they're moving in a direction that's beginning to be productive, I think, in helping to de-balkanize, and that's because we have to be more effective. So I think there's some utility there, and I think that the argument gets better going forward because of economic necessity, if that makes sense. Or if it doesn't, I mean, everybody should feel free to weigh in here, but that's how I'm seeing it and experiencing it in sort of the interactions with the marketplace right now. So I think there's some opportunities. And what I'd like is a parallel conversation to the what are we doing sort of near term and opportunistically, a parallel set of discussion that might be a subset. I mean, not everybody's going to be interested in this domain of things about that. I think we need that in order to fully leverage where we might head.
So I have a question for you on slide 6. In the small type at the bottom, you wrote normalizing the consumption of the EDR capability via the stick shifter mapping approach won't work due to limitations in what products expose. We need a model, probably 2 models. Can you kind of describe what the 2 model approach is that you're talking about there?
The 2 models are just the recognition that I think there are 2 normalizations that all the EDR tools deal with today. There's a normalization of what they're talking to get their information. If I'm looking for anomalies in the registry on Windows, I got 2 places to look: the registry API and the Hive file that represents the state of the registry itself. And any inconsistency between those tells me somebody's hooking the registry API. That kind of stuff, it doesn't change across the EDR and tool environment. So it's a place at which I've got a normalization. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So what are the 2 different models again? The first one is
the first one is that instrumentation talks to the asset they're trying to characterize or information about them. That's normalized, at least at that level where I'm talking about primitives that I'm observing or behaviors that I'm observing. The other one is at the back end, the indicators, right? The breadcrumbs that tell me a thing has already occurred in terms of attack behavior. There we also have a normalization. Those indicators, they're the same no matter what tool I'm dealing with. And as we begin to look more sophisticatedly, attack behaviors. Malware doesn't change because of the tool that I'm using to defend it. I've still got the same malware behavior. I'm using different tools to look at it, to do interpretation, and then to do action.
So if I could kind of brief back there, is one is the direct indications direct or indirect indications of the behavior that's being perpetuated by a malicious actor, and the other one is the state or the effect or the indications of the effect of that behavior on my system. Is it kind of something?
I think that's exactly right. Or the ways I would
Okay.
detect it. You know, how the camera looks at things, if that makes sense.
Got it.
And all that says is if I got a model at either end, they're very useful across EDR implementations, whereas any model
Sure.
between them seems a challenge, if that makes sense.
Okay, no, and I would just respond to that with being, you know, we would hopefully build our knowledge model framework to be able to represent both of those entities or collection of entities and phenomena in the same structure. So it would be two different modules of this using the same model.
I think that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, good. And then and I would even extend it then to slide 8. No, I'm sorry. Slide 10. When we're bringing good old John Boyd into discussion, you would your model informed orientation. So your depiction, kind of what we just discussed, is everything that's kind of in that pentagram in the middle, right?
Yeah.
And so it would be in that we could represent in the same model framework that we would represent everything else outside of that pentagram that's occurring on that slide. And if you guys all remember back to when I talked about first, second, and third order reality, you were mixing all of those things here. That's basically what we do when we create some simplified representation of the world. But we could represent everything going on here in the same general framework, even though you're modeling different things with that framework.
And in that sense, don't we get a glimmer of an upper ontology that is tool independent, and then a relevance to the. Yeah.
Completely. That's why when the modeling work we did, we talked about we extend from BFO and CCO. That's going to be completely agnostic. That applies to any representation, not just cyber stuff. Yeah, absolutely. And what that allows us to do then is then integrate all of this work with anything we do with the like operational. How does what happens in cyberspace impact my business operations and all the other stuff, which is ultimately the questions that the C-suite wants answered once we actually finish talking our geek speak to them.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I just make that foot stomp because in case people are wondering, like, why am I making it so hard? When we do the ontology work, that's because we want to be able to create solutions that will allow us to expand our interoperability, not just between tool suites that we use for cybersecurity, but for general security across the enterprise and for other, how cyberspace activities impact others, because ultimately that helps our stakeholders justify the investments that they need to make in their cybersecurity solutions.
And I think that's also recognized at the interchange of threat intelligence information level.
Yeah,
STIX with
exactly.
2.1 has just incorporated the MITRE ATT&CK collections precisely to step past just simple indicators being exchanged to dealing with full behaviors in context. And so I think we're fraying at the edges on multiple places where we see ourselves needing to go to the next level just to get more effective and more efficient in what happens, even in the communication of indicators, sort of STIX's ambition, as opposed to a more full ambition that MITRE has of, for instance, in a tool agnostic way, beginning to capture attack behavior. And so I think there is a convergence of the recognition across multiple disciplines in cybersecurity that we needed those models to help bridge the gap between the various disciplines, their tool sets, the signals, and the intelligence that we cultivate as a consequence. But it is a big conversation.
Yeah, that comes out in slide 14, the top bullet in slide 14. By the way, in case anybody didn't read all the way to those slides.
So the big gap in here for me is that I didn't turn this into speaker notes that try to articulate this that might be worth doing sort of as maybe a group exercise. Make this more comprehensible, just as a way of clarifying why we're doing what we're doing. But I do think there are two objectives for the group in general here. The immediate, do what we can with what we've got, and then separately what I think is somewhat longer term, look for what we can exploit in a broader ambition. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense to me.
Russ, I don't know what you had planned for the rest of the time, but I can give a quick update on the ontology subgroup.
Oh yeah, why don't you go ahead and do that? Because that again, thanks a lot. That is a great presentation, really, really helpful.
Yeah.
But yeah, go ahead, Forrest. Go ahead and give us an update. It'd be great.
So unfortunately, I don't have a very constructive update, but what we've been trying to do, we tried to meet with Sean Barnum again, and we thought we had something scheduled with him this morning, and that for some reason fell through again. And the reason we want to do that is the UCO work, if people have had a chance to look at that, they've done a lot of work on the ontology front, right? A lot of the terms and concepts and stuff. Between that and the CCO work that's already in place, what I was hoping to do is really just kind of, in the MITRE ATT&CK framework, for example, we looked at, there's lots of stuff that we've done that we just need to kind of put together in useful structures for us. But we were not able to get in touch with Sean today, so we're going to keep doing that. With the dog in. Okay. We're going to keep doing that, and then Ian and I'm trying to make sure I can have Ian still available to help as we go forward, even though he's moving to another supervisor. The reason he's moving to another supervisor is because I'm going to part-time starting January, and I believe that I will still be able to dedicate a couple hours to OCA. So I intend to keep working on this with Ian, and actually end up being more on my own time, but that's okay. And so we're going to keep pressing forward. So this might be between the use case stuff that we've been developing slowly with, and then, I don't know, maybe some of the stuff that's in these slides. Dennis might have some specific examples of things we want to put together in a model. Representative models or modules, and then try to figure out how we can then, like, specifically what's on slide 6 here, some specific examples of this, and to show how the ontology might help normalizing some of these pieces.
Yeah, that would be great for us.
So
yeah.
we're just very slowly pressing ahead. If we can get together with Sean. And he represents MITRE, and maybe we can bring MITRE into the fold and get this a little bit more energized. So that's our goal.
Sounds like a good approach. That's great. That's good.
Not that you need it, but I can't recommend Sean more heavily in terms of having both the perspective and the experience with his work in Cybox and Mike, and of course the stick side of the fence. Understanding also, having gone through the process and had the scar tissue, what'll work in standardization and what's going to get pushed back.
Yeah, we would like to leverage. You've done a lot of work already. A lot of it's been put into UCO, and so we just need to understand it further to figure out how we can leverage it. So.
Okay. Anybody else have anything else they'd like to add? Otherwise, we've now completed 2021's architecture meetings. Congratulations. We've gone through the year. Good news. We still have 7 or 8 survivors, so that's good. That's awesome. I appreciate you guys hanging in there. And again, Dennis, thanks so much for this work. It was really helpful. I found it really enlightening. Appreciate all the detail as well. So, okay, guys, I will call meetings in January, probably a couple weeks into January. You know how it is when you get back. It's hard to get back on track. So it'll probably be second or third week of January before we restart this group again, unless you guys have some urgency. That's what I'm going to do. And I'll set the meetings back up again, and we'll continue our cadence. I guess, Dennis, you and I could talk about framing the next steps with your recommendation and what we can do to push one of those paths forward or start working on both of them. So I'll probably need your help there.
Well, certainly we ought to have a broader conversation as well. So maybe the outcome of that conversation is more asynchronous engagement with the broader set of participants.
Yeah, because I think one of them, I think your first one recommended we reach out to some of the EDR vendors. I think, I could probably do that as a very specific step to get them engaged, to take a look at what we've done so far in the architecture, see if we can get them to help us, with their knowledge of the EDR side.
And I think all of them have on their roadmaps a movement towards embracing a broader set of, for the stuff that is sort of consensus based, almost universally recognized that that's not where they're really competing. Opening that up helps them hugely in integration. So.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, it's one of those things where if we can get together, we can all have better value and compete on the other end of the spectrum. The other one's just a kind of a means to an end, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, everybody, thank you so much for joining. Appreciate the discussion today again. And everybody have a wonderful holiday. Enjoy it with family and friends, and we'll see you in the new year.
Okay. Well, I'd certainly like to thank Dennis again. That's plenty of holiday reading. So this is this is great. Thanks.
All right, thank you.
Yeah,
everybody.
thanks, Dennis. Have a happy holidays, everybody.
Happy
And
holidays.
thank you, Russ, for
Have a great
moving this
one.
along.
Too.
All right, guys.
Have a great
Take
one.
care.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Yep.